She didn't flinch. She simply set her glass down on the white tablecloth and looked at her hands. Across the table, her husband was still talking. Cornelius Hale had a way of speaking that filled every room he entered. Not because his voice was loud, but because no one had ever taught him that silence had value. He spoke the way men of his standing often did, as if the words themselves were less important than the fact that he was the one saying them. And on that particular evening, in the dining room of the Hale family house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, with the candles burning low and his mother seated to his right, he said something that Thea could never unhear. "I suppose it's fortunate, Mother, that no one expected her to be decorative." He was not looking at Thea when he said it. He was reaching for his wine. His mother, Mrs. Eugenia Hale, made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something near enough to one that it served the same purpose. And Thea, who had been married to Cornelius for 14 months by then, felt something shift inside her chest, not break. Something worse than break, something go very, very still. She had grown up knowing she wasn't the kind of woman men wrote poems about. Her father, Edgar Sutton, had told her as much when she was 12, not cruelly, but with the blunt practicality of a man who believed the truth was a gift, regardless of the shape it arrived in. "You have a fine mind, Theodora," he had said, "and a fine mind will serve you longer than a fine face." She had believed him then. She had gone on believing him through her schooling in Richmond, through her seasons in society that produced more conversation than courtship, through the arrangement that brought her to Cornelius Hale at 23 years old. It had not been a love match. She had understood that going in. The Sutton land adjoined the Hale land at a long diagonal, and when Edgar Sutton's health began to fail, the question of what would happen to the acreage became pressing in the way that all practical questions become pressing when money is involved. Cornelius was 31, recently returned from a year in England, and in need of a wife who would bring property rather than expenses to the arrangement. Thea was 23, competent and available. They had been introduced at her cousin's dinner. He had spoken well. She had answered well. Her father had been pleased. And 4 months later she had stood in the parlor of her childhood home and said the words that made her Theodora Hale, and watched her name change the way a river changes when it crosses into different country, the same water, moving differently. She had not expected love. She had expected, at minimum, respect. What she had found instead was this: a house run entirely according to the preferences of Eugenia Hale, a husband who deferred to his mother on every matter from the dinner menu to the management of the tenants, and a particular kind of loneliness that had no name because no one in her position was supposed to admit it existed. She had tried. That was the thing she wanted to remember clearly, in the years that came after. She had tried with real effort and without visible resentment. She had managed the household accounts when Eugenia allowed it. She had organized the linen inventory. She had written letters on behalf of the estate, politely, correctly, in the hand her father had paid a tutor to teach her. She had sat at that dining table for 14 months, and eaten what was served, and said what was appropriate, and smiled when smiling was called for. And then Cornelius had reached for his wine and said what he said, and the trying had simply stopped. She did not make a scene. She did not cry. She looked at her hands for a moment, at the thin gold band on her finger, at the knuckles she had scraped helping the groundskeeper repair the fence along the lower pasture because no one else was going to do it. And then she folded her napkin with great care and placed it beside her plate and excused herself from the table. She said she had a headache. Eugenia murmured something about the heat. Cornelius did not look up. Thea climbed the stairs to the room she had occupied since the wedding. Not the room that adjoined Cornelius's, which Eugenia had repurposed as a sitting room for herself with barely a word of explanation, but the smaller room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faced east and caught the morning light. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of a carriage on the road, and closer, the cricket starting up in the tall grass beyond the garden wall. She thought about her father. Edgar Sutton had died 8 months into her marriage, quietly and without warning, the way practical men often went, as if dying was simply a matter that needed attending to, and he had attended to it. He had left the land, as agreed, in trust under the terms of the marriage contract. He had left her a letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. "You have a fine mind, Theodora. Use it." She stood up. She did not pack hurriedly. That was important to her afterward, when she thought about it. That she had not panicked, had not grabbed things blindly in the dark. She worked methodically, the way she had always worked, going through the wardrobe and selecting what was hers and only what was hers. The dresses that had come with the trousseau. the books from her father's library that she had brought with her. The small cedar box that held her mother's brooch and the letter from Edgar and a photograph taken in the spring of 1858 that showed her father standing in front of the Sutton house, squinting into the sun, looking exactly like the person he had been. She took the account ledger she had maintained for the past year, because she had written it and the numbers in it were her numbers, and she believed they would matter later. She did not take the pearls Eugenia had lent her for the wedding and never technically returned. By 2 in the morning the trunk was packed and the house was quiet. She sat in the chair by the east window until the first thin line of gray appeared at the edge of the sky. Then she pinned her hat and carried it down the stairs herself because there was no one she was willing to wake. She left a note on the hall table. It said, "I have gone to my cousin's house in Alexandria. I will write when I am settled. T. Sutton." She used her maiden name. It was the first time she had done so in 14 months, and she noticed, with some surprise, how naturally it came back to her, the way a word comes back that you've been trying to remember. All at once, and obvious, and wondering how you'd ever let it go. Her cousin was Augusta Marsh, née Sutton, 10 years older, and the sort of woman who asked one careful question, and then listened to the whole answer before she asked another. She opened the door herself when Thea arrived just after sunrise, still in her traveling clothes, with a trunk and a traveling bag and an expression that Augusta read entirely correctly without being told a word. "Come in," Augusta said. "I'll put the kettle on." Thea stayed 3 days without explaining, and Augusta did not ask. On the 4th day, over breakfast, Thea told her what Cornelius had said at the dinner table, and Augusta listened, and when it was over she said only, "What do you need?" "Work," Thea said. "Something real." Augusta was married to Charles Marsh, who practiced land law in Alexandria and had more cases than he had hours to attend to them. It was Augusta who brought up the matter of the survey dispute that had been tangled in the county court for 2 years. It was Augusta who said, "You know land, Thea. You grew up on it." Half the men in that courtroom couldn't find a boundary marker on a clear day with a compass. Thea looked at her cousin. "Charles would let me help?" "Charles," Augusta said, "is desperate." It was not the work Thea had imagined for herself, but she had stopped imagining things for herself sometime in the first weeks of her marriage, and this was something concrete, something her hands and her mind could actually touch. Charles Marsh gave her the survey maps for the dispute, 2 neighboring properties in Fairfax County, whose boundary had been contested since 1849, and she spent 5 days at the table in Augusta's back parlor with the maps spread out before her, and her father's surveying notes, which she had carried in the ledger box, because she had known, without knowing she knew, that they might be useful. She found the original marker reference. It was in a secondary notation in the county record, cross-reference to a cedar tree that had long since been cut but whose stump remained, and when she wrote out her findings in a clean memorandum for Charles, he read it twice and then looked at her with an expression that was entirely new to her coming from a man, something she slowly identified as simple, uncomplicated respect. "This is right," he said. "I know it is," she said. The case resolved within the month. Charles sent a letter to a colleague in Richmond who had a similar matter pending. The colleague sent back a response and then a retainer. She was not a lawyer. She could not stand in court. But what she could do was read a survey, trace a chain of title, identify the place where the language of a deed and the reality of the land diverged. And it turned out that this was rarer and more valuable than she had ever been told. The letter from Cornelius arrived 6 weeks after she left. It had been forwarded from Augusta's address to the small set of rooms Thea had taken above a milliner's shop on King Street, a concession to independence that cost her most of what she had in her purse, and that she considered the finest money she had ever spent. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. She set it on the table and made herself a cup of tea first. The letter was 4 pages. She had expected it to be shorter. He was not angry. Or rather, he was, but he had been careful to write around the anger in such a way that it showed through the gaps between his sentences rather than in the sentences themselves. He said that her behavior had been irregular. He said that she had caused talk. He said that his mother was unwell and that Thea's absence had created difficulties. He said, and this was the sentence she read 3 times, that she could not simply leave a marriage because she found it inconvenient. She put the letter down. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back. 2 pages in her best hand, clear and cool, and without a single adjective that could be called unkind. "Dear Mr. Hale, I did not leave because I found the marriage inconvenient. I left because you stated, in the presence of your mother and the household staff, that my purpose was not decorative. You were correct. I am not decorative. I am competent, and I have gone to be competent somewhere that the quality is appreciated. I wish your mother a swift recovery. I remain T. Sutton. She sent it before she could reconsider. She did not hear back for 2 weeks. Then a second letter arrived, and this one was different in a way she identified before she fully understood it. It was shorter and it had been written more than once. She could tell by the unevenness of the paragraphs, the way the handwriting changed, register somewhere in the middle, as if he had stopped and stopped again. He said he had not intended to be cruel. He said the remark had been careless and that he understood she was wounded by it. He said, and here the handwriting changed, that the house was not the same without her. She sat with this for a long while. The truth was that she had not decided anything. She had decided to leave. She had not decided what leaving meant in any permanent sense. The marriage contract was the marriage contract, and the land was the land, and those two facts enclosed her life like walls, regardless of how she felt about the man inside them. She was not a woman who could afford to ignore architecture. But she was also not a woman who would return to a house where she was invisible. She wrote back. She told him that if he wished to speak with her, he was welcome to come to Alexandria, and that she would hear what he had to say. She told him that she would not return to Fredericksburg under the current conditions. She told him, and she chose these words slowly, the way you choose the right tool for a job that matters. That she was willing to consider what a different arrangement might look like, but that he would need to tell her himself, in person, what he was actually asking for. She did not ask about Eugenia. She felt that this was important. He came on a Thursday, on a gray October morning, when the leaves in the square outside her window were coming down in small, irregular showers. She heard the knock at the outer door and answered it herself because Mrs. Porter, who managed the building, was away that morning, and she opened the door to find Cornelius Hale standing in the street in his good coat with his hat in his hands, looking, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was not entirely sure what to do next. She stepped back. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He sat at her small table in her small rooms above the milliner's shop and looked at the maps pinned to the wall and the ledger open on the side table and the stack of case notes Charles had sent over that morning, and she watched him look at all of it in silence. "You've been working," he said. "Yes," she said. Land surveys, title chains, deed language. There's more demand for it than you'd think." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father taught you." "My father let me watch. I taught myself." She poured the tea and sat across from him and waited, because she had learned. From her father, from Augusta, from the long, careful months of her marriage, that silence was not a void to be filled but a space to be occupied, and that the person who spoke first was not necessarily the person who was right. Cornelius set his hat on the table beside his cup. He looked at his hands. "What I said," he began. "I know what you said. I've thought about it every day since." She believed him. That was the complicated thing. She looked at his face, and she believed that he had, and that it had cost him something, and that the cost had surprised him. He was not a cruel man. She had never thought he was a cruel man. He was a man who had never been required to examine himself, and examining himself was turning out to be harder than he had expected. "I should have said something," he said. When my mother has spoken to you, I should have said something before." "Yes," Thea said. "You should have." "I don't know that I knew how." "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, "That doesn't make it easier to live with." He nodded. He was not arguing. She noticed that, held it in her mind as data. "What would you need," he said finally, "to consider coming back?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the evenings in her small rooms, and in the mornings over her tea, and in the long careful hours at the table with the maps, where she had noticed that the most intractable boundary disputes were always the ones where neither party had ever clearly stated what they actually wanted. She had decided she would not make that mistake. "The accounts," she said. "I want full management of the household accounts. Not advisory, not subject to review. Mine." He nodded slowly. "All right, my rooms, not the East Hall room. The Southeast suite, which has not been used since before the wedding. That's a large." He stopped himself. "All right." She looked at him across the table in the gray October light. "And your mother," she said, "will not speak to me as she has spoken to me. I won't enumerate what that means. You know what it means. If it happens, I will leave again, and the next time I will not write to ask permission for the conversation before I go." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cart went by on King Street, and the sound of the horses' hooves on the cobblestones came up through the window, and then faded. "She won't like it," he said. "No," Thea said. "She won't. She'll say, 'Cornelius.'" It was the first time she had used his given name all morning, and it landed between them with a different weight. What she says to you is between you and your mother. What happens in our house is between you and me. I am asking you to decide which conversation is the more important one. He looked at her. She looked back. In the end, it was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one. He picked up his teacup and held it in both hands and looked out the window at the leaves coming down in the square, and after a long while he said, "I'd like you to come home," and she said, "I know. I'm asking if you understand what that means." "I think I'm beginning to," he said. That was not the same as yes. She was a woman who understood land and boundary lines, and the difference between an approximate description and a legal one. And she knew that "I'm beginning to" was an approximate description. But she also knew that approximate descriptions were where all the careful work started. That you began with what you could see, and you worked outward from there, measuring and recording, and correcting as you went, until the shape of the thing became clear. She told him she would need another week. He said that he understood. He put his hat back on, and stood, and at the door he paused and said her name, not Mrs. Hale, but Thea, the way people said it who had known her before she had a husband's name. And she looked at him and waited. "I don't know that I'm a man who says things the right way," he said. "But I've been thinking, since you left, that it's possible I've never tried." She said, "That's a reasonable place to start." He left. She stood at the window and watched him cross the square, in the October morning, his coat collar up against the chill, and she thought about her father standing in front of the house in the 1858 photograph, squinting into the sun. She thought about what he had said. She thought about the question of whether a fine mind and the will to use it were enough to build something real on, or whether they required another person to build toward. She thought they might. She was not certain. But she had learned, in the past 8 weeks, that uncertainty was not the same as weakness. That you could move forward without knowing the destination, as long as you kept your compass and your notes and your own clear accounting of where you had been. She went back to the table. She had work to finish. She picked up her pen, and the morning light came through the east window the way it always did, finding her exactly where she had chosen to be.